If you have your Bibles, you can flip them open to Psalm 33. If you don't have your Bibles, that's okay, because we're really using this as a launching point. We're going to be kind of all over the scriptures, as well as going through various quotes. So, like I said, I want to keep this as concise as possible. This is stuff that's been going on in my head for like the last 3 years, so you guys are getting kind of like work in progress, and I hope that doesn't offend you either. I do like writing to a certain extent. I've written 2 books so far. One is on kind of the nature of sin. The other is on PTSD, and I talk about my times in the Marines and how it affected me. The current book I'm working on right now is about beauty in the arts and how the church has approached beauty in the arts throughout history, and how I feel that we have kind of made a mistake in a lot of ways as Christians when it comes to this topic, and how we can kind of look at it in maybe a little bit of a different way. So this is Psalm 33, verse 1. And it says, "Shout for joy in the Lord, O you righteous. Praise befits the upright. Give thanks to the Lord with the lyre. Make melody to him with the harp of 10 strings. Sing to him a new song. Play skillfully on the strings with loud shouts. For the word of the Lord is upright, and all his work is done in faithfulness. He loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the steadfast love of the Lord. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their host. He gathers the water of the sea as a heap, and he puts the deeps in storehouses." And that's about as far as we're going to get tonight. So when we're talking about the concept of beauty in the arts, the obvious question that we have to answer, so I'm going to try to answer these in subsequent order. The first one is, what is beauty? The second one is, what is art? And then we need to then parallel that to, how does that apply to my Christian life? Or does the Bible have anything really to say about these topics whatsoever? And then we're going to kind of wrap it up by talking about some of the benefits of beauty and some of the objections to what I'm about to tell you. And I'm going to try to give them as much clarity as I can. So first question is, what is beauty? So C.S. Lewis, who's a famous Christian author, he wrote a really fascinating book that almost no one read called The Abolition of Man. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you guys have heard of that book before? The Abolition of Man? How many of you guys have actually read it? Okay, that's okay. You should read it. It's a really, really good book. In The Abolition of Man, he was utilizing certain trends that he saw during that time to predict the future, to predict what the world was going to look like in the future. And the latter part of it gets a little sci-fi and it gets a little crazy. He talks about genetic alteration of human beings and stuff. So if you're into that kind of thing, read that book. If you don't want to read a nonfiction on that, read another book that he wrote called That Hideous Strength, which is excellent. And that is like his view of what the book of Revelation is going to look like. And it's very sci-fi. It's really, really cool and fun. But in The Abolition of Man, he's predicting what is going to cause the downfall of mankind. What's going to cause us as a species to kind of stamp ourselves out. And he looked at a textbook that was circulating during that day in which it had students look at a section, look at a little passage, and the passage was written by a guy named Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and make an inference from the passage. So in the passage, it has 2 men walking up to a waterfall, and one describes the waterfall as being very pretty, and the other describes the waterfall as being sublime. And the question that the authors ask the student to answer is, which one of them is correct? And most people would say, well, this is the guy who said sublime, because that's a word I don't know what it means, so it must be more correct than pretty. And the authors of the textbook would then respond and say, actually, both of them are incorrect. What they should have said is, the waterfall elucidates feelings of beauty within me. It actually brings about feelings of sublimity, but it actually isn't beautiful in and of itself. Now, what the authors are saying, their philosophy is essentially, there is no such thing as objective beauty. Human beings create beauty subjectively through our experience. How many of you guys have heard the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder? Right? Art is subjective, that kind of thing. That's this philosophy. But it was in a more, I guess you'd call infantile state at the time that Lewis wrote this particular book. Now, throughout the book, he makes the argument that this concept of subjective beauty would undo humanity. that it would absolutely undo the culture that it existed in, and it would end up undoing us as a civilization and then finally as a species. That's why it's called the abolition of man. Now, that sounds kind of radical, and most people would be like, C.S. Lewis, you're exaggerating. I think it's not a very big deal that people think that art is subjective, because it is, and maybe you need to calm down. But he was getting at something. He was getting at something that our civilization had lost, and that is what the definition of beauty is. So for the majority of, I guess you'd call the last 600 or 700 years, the definition that most people have had about what beauty is has had something to do with God. It's only in our present day that people have moved away from that definition. They've said, well, beauty is not about God. Beauty is about man. We create it through our subjective experience. But prior to that, the concept of beauty was this. We as Christians, we serve an invisible God, correct? And because he's invisible, we can't represent him in a particular image. If I tried to represent God in an image, what would you guys call it? So if I try to make a little statue for you guys and I said, this is God, this is how I perceive God, what would you guys call that? An idol, right? Right? It's an idol. The reason why you'd call it an idol is because you can't fully represent God's nature. He's too great for that. And any attempt to represent God's nature is to lessen God. It's to make him less than he really is. However, what we believe about God is even though he's invisible and even though he's beyond our comprehension, there are ways that we can encounter him. And the primary way that we encounter him is through this thing that we call beauty. So this is my definition of beauty, and take it for what it is, because it's my definition, and it might be totally wrong. My definition of beauty is it's anything that parallels the invisible image of God. So in other words, when we call some things beautiful, what we're saying is in some way, this thing represents God whom I can't see. This is why we have judgments of beauty. We say this is more beautiful, this is less beautiful, this is ugly, this is pretty, this is sublime, right? We use this language because there's something in us that recognizes goodness. But have you ever tried to define why you find certain things to be better than others? Right? Why would I find, for instance, one song as superior to another song? Or why would I say that one book is better than another book, or one movie is better than another movie? Or why would I say that a certain tree looks more beautiful than another tree, or a flower, or something like that? What are these judgment calls based off of? And for the people that C.S. Lewis was arguing against, the judgment calls are just arbitrary. It's just whatever I think. But for us as Christians, what we would say is, no, it has something to do with the nature of God. It has something to do with his invisible image. And this is what the psalmist is saying. He's saying that God brings forth the universe, and it bears components of his invisible image. Now it's fallen, and that fallenness means that it also bears marks of the fall. That's why there's ugliness in the universe as well. But when we're looking at the creation, we're seeing something that pertains to God, something that brings us forward to God. So I'm going to bring up this quote. This is from a guy named Roger Scruton. Passed away a couple years ago, unfortunately. But he says this: anybody who goes through life with an open mind and open heart will encounter these moments of revelation. And these are saturated with meaning, but this meaning cannot be put into words. These moments are precious to us. When they occur, it is as though on the winding, ill-lit stairway of our life, we suddenly come across a window through which we catch sight of another world, a brighter world, to which we belong, but we cannot enter. Now, what Roger Scruton is saying is something that all of us have experienced. When you experience genuine beauty, whether it's falling in love for the first time, or whether it's even just experiencing great art, right? Watching a movie that really moves you, or listening to music that really moves you, or something like that, or just looking at a sunset, there's something in you that's moved. And it's moved to an extent that you know it's pointing to something else. It's pointing to something greater. it feels more real than your life in some ways. And oftentimes we don't even care that the representations that we're being moved by are not real. They're not true to one extent or another. So for instance, when I watch a movie, if I watch like a chick flick, like a romance or something, a rom-com or something like that, especially the older ones, the newer ones are garbage, but in the older ones, what you see is you see depictions of love that we all know to one extent or another are inaccurate. They're fluffy. They're overly glamorized. They're not how love actually works, right? You listen to a song like by a guy named Ed Sheeran who's talking about, I like the song Perfect, where he talks about just his experiences with this girl. Forget the fact that he hasn't had a successful relationship. But you listen to the words, you listen to the lyrics, and there's something in you that knows that it's true. You experience a movement that you can't really explain. So even though you know relationships don't look like this, relationships in their best moments do look like this. So even though you recognize somewhere in your heart the moments of the relationship that actually look and feel like what he's describing are small, and the moments that feel mundane and common are more prevalent, and the moments that are distressing are sometimes even more prevalent than that. Even though at one level you understand that, at another level you don't believe it, right? You're able to be carried along by his vision of what love actually is, and you don't dispute it. The reason why you don't dispute it is because deep down you know this is pointing to something else. It's pointing to something greater. And that thing that it's pointing to, for us as Christians, we believe it's God. The reason why we experience love like that is because there is a perfect love that really is like that all the time. And that love exists in the perfection of God. And he's bringing us into a reality. He's bringing that reality that Roger Scruton says we taste it in moments of beauty, but it goes away. What God is doing is he's bringing that reality down to this earth. That was the whole point of why Jesus came to this earth. He's taking the reality that we want so desperately to be true, and he's making it true. He's making it real. He's hollowing all the experiences of your life, and he's giving them validity. That's, by the way, why Jesus lived a normal life. I don't know if you guys ever wondered why he did that, because all he really needed to do was die, right? Why would he live 30 years on this earth? Why would he experience all the things that you and I experience? He experienced joy and happiness. He experienced love and friendship. He experienced connection and loss. Everything that you and I experience, he experienced. Why? He is making holy the everyday experiences of human life. And he's showing us that these things point to something greater. You're not being deceived. You're not being tricked by your emotions when you feel as though those things are pointing to something greater. They really are. As a matter of fact, the Greek word for beauty is the word kalos. We get our word to call from it. Beauty calls you home. That's what it does. We do belong somewhere, and that home to which we belong to is a home that is saturated in beauty. And all the beauty that exists on this earth calls us forward. It calls us to that greater and higher world. This is what ended up converting C.S. Lewis from an atheist to a Christian. Because he had all these experiences with beauty, but they would fade away. And he couldn't understand why, as a naturalistic, higher animal, why would he have these cravings for beauty when they don't mean anything? And this was the conclusion that he came to. Some of you guys may be familiar with what I'm about to quote. In his book, Mere Christianity, he says, "If I find in myself a desire that nothing on this earth can fulfill, I must conclude that I was not built for this earth." There's something higher to which beauty calls us. So what is art then? Art, I'll quote Coleridge again, because why not? He was a romantic poet. He's pretty good. I would recommend you read some of his poetry if you're into poetry. If you hate poetry, don't try, because he's old and you might hate it afterwards. But if you're into poetry, read Coleridge, because he's amazing. And Coleridge talked about the imagination of humans, and it is by our imagination that we form art. And he said this: the imagination of man is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation. It's a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation. Now, if you don't understand what that means, that's okay. I'm about to explain it to you. So what he's talking about is he's saying that God, when he's forming the earth, and by the way, in this psalm that we just read, he forms it with his mouth. He calls the earth into existence. And after he calls the earth into existence, what's the refrain in Genesis 1? He creates something and he says, it is good. By the way, I think that's a bad translation. And the reason why I think it's a bad translation is because in the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, they didn't use the word good to translate that phrase. They used the word beauty. So God is not saying it is good. He's saying what? It is beautiful. He's delighting in his creation as he calls it forward, which is really cool. I like that. Now, as he's creating the earth, right, he's creating the cosmos, he's adorning the heavens, which again is another artistic word, right? To adorn something means to decorate it, right? So he's literally decorating the universe with beauty. It's not just a utilitarian universe where everything has a function, this is a side note, by the way. There are atheists that actually say that the created order, the universe, is not created. And the reason why they believe it's not created is because it's inefficient. And they say, well, God, if there was really a God, he would have made this or that quality much more efficient. And the obvious answer that I would give to someone like that is you're assuming that God is an engineer and that he's trying to make the creation as efficient as possible, where the God of the Bible is an artist. And when an artist creates something, the furthest question from their mind is it efficient? Because by definition, art is not efficient. It is superfluous by definition. If it was efficient and necessary, it ceases to be art. All right, so what is it? So again, he's creating, building, up, finally gets to man. Now, what can man do? Man can observe the creation and then imagine beyond the bounds that God has already established. The first time that man does this, he does it twice, by the way, in the very first 2 chapters. The first time he does it is he names the animals. So God brings the animals to Adam. Adam experiences them, and then he calls them by name. And the names are recognized by God and affirmed by God, and then the created order continues to go. That is a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation. Adam has a finite mind. He has a limited consciousness. He sees the created work of God, and he adds to that creation via his internal experience. He does it again in Genesis 2 when God brings Eve to him. And when God brings Eve to him, I think this is amazing, he actually busts out into a song. He says, "At last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." And then Moses adds a little addendum to it. "For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." But Adam's exaltation, his spontaneous act of creation in that moment, was an inspired moment of beauty. He sees something in Eve that he finds precious, and he has to create. He has to make something out of that experience. So to put it another way, what art is a refraction of the created order through the prism of the human soul. We are all, at all times, creating art. All the time, you and I are experiencing the creation of God, and those experiences are completely unique to you. No one has ever experienced a sunset like you. And each night, each day, you experience it a little bit differently. No one has ever fallen in love exactly like you. You are participating in the eternal act of creation. We are the 8th day of creation that is going on all the time. Now, the difference between you, and some of you might be artistic, but the difference between an artist and you, a genuine artist, is that they can give those experiences breath. They can take those experiences and they can make someone else experience the exact same emotion without having gone through the exact same experience. So if I'm a poet, I could take the experience of falling in love and I could express it, I could represent it in such a way that even someone who's never fallen in love can feel exactly what I feel. And this is why sometimes we get frustrated, right? Sometimes we have these amazing experiences and we try to share it with someone, we get all psyched. We're like, man, it was like this and it was crazy. And then you realize they're not getting anything you're saying. And you say, you had to have been there, right? What are you saying? You suck as an artist, right? That's what you're saying. I can't represent this experience to you. I can't do it. What an artist can do is they can represent it. And there are many different mediums in which they can do that. They could do it in music. They could do it in poetry and song. They could do it in painting. They could do it in stories. There are numerous ways that we could represent our experiences to others. But what makes art art is our ability to do that, to represent experiences to other people that they can take in. And that's why we consider some artists better than others. Some artists can share their experiences and there's only like a little niche group that gets what they're saying. But then other artists share their experience and everybody gets what they're saying. They're able to communicate across time and space, across generations and cultures, across gender and across distinctions. The true artists are ones that communicate perpetually. They're the ones that can communicate to all men. This is why, again, some of us will go and will view art that was created hundreds of years ago because it stands the test of time. It continues to represent the human experience no matter what. This is why an entire book of the Bible is dedicated to art. The book of Psalms is 100% a book of artistic poetry. That's what it is. It is people experiencing things in life and then representing those experiences in poetry. Unless we think, by the way, the Psalms are all about praising God, most of them are not. The Psalms are about human experience. That's what they are. There are Psalms that are about depression, Psalm 88, Psalm 42. There are Psalms about fear, Psalm 27, Psalm 63. There are Psalms about loneliness, Psalm chapter 3. There are Psalms about anger, Psalm 73, Psalm 58. Every human experience that you could think of is represented in the Psalms. Which leads to, what is the purpose of art? Well, if that's what art is, then what does it do? Because art can represent the human experience, art helps us, it actually deepens the well of our own internal understanding of ourselves. There are so many times in your life that you're going to go through things and you don't know what you're going through. How many times have you experienced something, not only can you not put it into words, but you don't even understand what you're going through? Like, man, like, what's going on? I don't know. I feel something. You know, something's going on in there. I just don't know what it is. And you just have no clue how to even represent that thought to yourself. This also answers the question of why people like to watch sad movies. And most men are like, well, it's a girl thing, and they just like to cry. Girls just like to cry. That's not why people like to watch sad movies. The reason why people like to watch sad movies is because sadness and loss are natural human experiences, and they're incredibly complex and nuanced. It's hard for us to understand them. And so when you see loss and sadness and despair represented well, before you, it unlocks something in your soul. You begin to understand your experience. There are times where people will cry for the first time over a loss that they experienced years ago, watching somebody else's story. And it's because that emotion was trapped in their soul in between experience and expression. And the art unlocks it. Right? That's why we're desperate for it. That's why we're creating it all the time as human beings. That's why we spend the majority of our time in the arts. Think about how much time a day you spend listening to people represent experiences to you. How much time a day do you spend? And by the way, there's high art and low art. TikTok is a low art, but it is still an art, right? It is people representing their experience to you. Some people are doing it well, some people are doing it terribly. But altogether, that's what it is. You are experiencing someone else. And that's why, some people who criticize YouTubers and TikTokers and things like that, they're like, oh, that's like nothing. They're just doing it. Well, why is it that some people get a ton of views and some people don't? Is it not because there are some people who are really good at it and some people who are really terrible at it? It's not a difference in experience, it's a difference in representation. They're able to express it in a way that connects with a wider audience of people. That's why people keep going back to a particular person. And they might not even know that. It might be completely subconscious, but there's something that person is doing that pulls you, that calls you back over and over again to that person's experience. So art is very, very important. So what's wrong with art? Because we got to talk about that now. What's wrong with art? There are two attacks on the art world. One comes from inside the church, and the other comes from outside the church. So let's talk about the one that comes from inside the church first, because this one's pervasive, it's horrible, and it's kicked Christians out of the public square. Because if Christians stop representing our experience to the world, then our experience becomes something that nobody can relate to. You've cut yourself off from being able to connect with those around you. Beyond that, you've also left wide open a potential for Christians to seek outside of the church experiences that happen internally that are secular. Meaning that the majority of good art that's produced today is not produced by the church. And that's unfortunate, because we all need this. We all need this outlet because it does something for us. And if I can't get it inside the church, I'm going to get it outside the church. And here's the problem. If I'm getting it outside the church, that means I'm experiencing something through someone else's eyes that is not in agreement with me about the nature of reality. And that has potential to lead me astray. So, we're going to go way back. A guy named Clement of Alexandria. How many of you guys have heard of that guy? Man, he was a rock star in the early church, First 200 AD, everybody knew this guy's name. Not anymore. He wrote a trilogy of books called The Instructor, or The Pedagogus. And Clement was a student. I'm not going to get too much into his philosophy because it would probably bore you guys and you're not going to care. But Clement was a student of a guy named Plato. And Plato had some issues with the arts. He actually fought pretty stringently for restrictions on the arts, pretty heavy ones, if you've ever read the book, The Republic. So why did he not like the arts? Well, Clement, I think, does a very good job of explaining to us why he didn't like the arts. So this is from the second part of his trilogy, The Instructor. He says this: "We must be on guard against whatever pleasure titillates the eye and ear and effeminates us." Sorry, ladies. "For the various spells of the broken strains and plaintive numbers of the carrion muse corrupt men's morals, drawing to perturbation of mind by the licentious and mischievous art of music." Sorry, musicians. So what he's saying, in other words, is because art is experienced not intellectually but emotionally, it is, by definition, an irrational experience. And if it's irrational, then it's animalistic. And if it's animalistic, it will, by necessity, draw you away from God and pull you deeper and deeper into the world, in which you will become more corrupt by it. That was his philosophy. That's the idea. Now, there are many problems with the philosophy that he has exhibited. The first one is it's completely anti-biblical. But regardless of how anti-biblical it is a pervasive thought that exists inside the church. If you study a lot of Christian authors that exist today, as well as back in the day, the best you're going to get out of them about why art is important is they will say, well, it's not really important. It's kind of like chewing gum. It's not going to fill your stomach, but it's something to pass the time. It tastes good. It makes you feel good. That's about as good as you're going to get from many Christians today about why art is important. In fact, the majority of Christians tend to shame people for enjoying the arts. They portray it as a waste of time. You could be doing better things. Yeah, you watched a Netflix movie, but you could have been sharing your faith. You listened to that new Selena Gomez song, but you know what? You really could have been reading the Bible. The idea is that the arts are at best, they're a distraction from what is really important. How many of you guys have heard a message like that in the church? Something like that. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of nods, so I'm not crazy. I've heard that my whole life. In fact, I used to have this idea, as I became closer to pastors, that if I went into their homes, they would just have one pedestal with a Bible on it and no TV, no books or anything like that. That's what I really believed. And then you realize that pastors are just like everybody else. We watch movies, we watch TV shows. We just don't talk about it. We shy away from it. We pretend like we don't because we want to pretend as though that's all we do is read the Bible, even though that's not true. By ignoring or denying the impact and the importance of the arts, we're denying one of the most fundamental parts of human experience, right? Things that people seek out on a regular basis and want to create. Because of that, the church has come up with this idea that art is only good when it's propagandistic. In other words, when it can be used to bring someone to God, then it becomes useful, and we should invest in it. But if it's not, then it is useless. It's frivolous. Shouldn't be done. So if I make a movie, even if it's a terrible movie, but it has the right message in it, I've done good Christian art. But if I've made a good movie that has no gospel message in it, but it represents the human experience well, and it points people to beauty, I have failed as a Christian artist. I need to take Christian off my title. I'm just an artist. That's why the church has chased away some of the greatest talent that the church has created in the last several decades. The people that have actually been genuine artists, and most of them are musicians, by the way, have been mostly shut out of the public sphere of Christianity because they don't make explicit Christian music and art. So it's considered a waste. Well, it's better than listening to, Taylor Swift, but, still not as good as listening to Jeremy Camp. And it's just not true, right? It's a total failure of imagination. It's a failure of understanding what the arts are for. So is it true? Is it true that arts are an irrational thing? And the answer to that question is no, they're not. I could get into this for a long period of time. I'm not going to. Sorry, again, I don't want to bore you. But let's talk about boredom real quick, because why not? The reason why we're bored oftentimes is because what we're saying when you say, I'm bored, it's not that you're not intaking information, it's that you don't care about the information. And if you're bored about information, your ability to retain it goes to zero. Your ability to comprehend and retain the information that you're receiving goes to basically zero. That's why oftentimes, and I could harp on this as well, sermons, what I'm doing right now, is an art form. Rhetoric is what the ancients used to call it. It's the ability to use common language to express thoughts and experiences to others. The reason why a lot of times, and pastors harp on this all the time, they're like, have you ever had Monday morning amnesia where someone asks you, hey, what'd you learn in church the other day? And you say, I don't know. Well, that's because, you didn't write it down. You didn't think about it. Or maybe you suck at teaching. And maybe you bored everybody in the audience and they didn't retain anything you said, because even though it was true and even though the information and message were good, it wasn't beautiful. And you lost your audience. Just because something's true and just because the message is good doesn't mean that people are going to receive it. It has to also be beautiful. This is, by the way, what frustrated people about Jesus. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, those were like the intellectuals of the day. And here's Jesus coming out of Nazareth with a thick accent that they mocked him for, a hick from the sticks, and he's talking about fields and seeds and birds, and people are like, this is so dumb. This guy doesn't know anything. He's uneducated, and he just tells stories all the time. But you know what? Everybody remembers the teachings of Jesus, even people that don't like Jesus. Nobody remembers what those guys taught. Jesus was an engaging teacher. People liked listening to him. Many people who don't even believe in Jesus know, if you said like, hey, you know the parable of like the sower? Have you ever heard that before? Most people are like, yeah, I heard that before. That's kind of a cool story, Or the prodigal son, right? A lot of Jesus' stories are popular because they're human experiences that are clearly spoken in a way that people can relate to. Right? When you listen to the story of the prodigal son, hey, even if you don't have kids, can you relate to someone that you love, someone that you cherish, somebody that you want to love you back, rejecting you and hating you and leaving you and mistreating you? All of us can relate to that. That's why that story resonates with us. That's why we like it. It has a higher implication because all beauty has a higher implication. If it's a human experience, it has a divine origin. That's the whole point. We're made in the image and likeness of God. So, beauty captivates. This is from Simone Weil. I like her. She's really bright, writes a lot of cool books. This one's from Waiting on God. And she says, beauty captivates the soul in order to ask permission from the mind to enter in. Beauty captivates the soul in order to ask permission from the mind to enter in. The reason why we retain certain things over others is because we find them beautiful, or we find them ugly. And that's true as well. That's why we like horror movies. We like the morose, we like the macabre, we like the grotesque. It sticks with you, right? Because it's ugly. It's the antithesis to beauty, which has a purpose. I'm not going to get into it tonight, but it does have a purpose in art. So beauty is actually not irrational. Beauty is actually highly rational. It is the basis. It's the splendor of the truth. It's the radiance of the truth. It's the only way that you're going to get truth into your life is through the experiential beauty that is represented in art forms. That's the only way it's going to happen. So here's the problem. Can beauty be used, therefore, to tell lies? If beauty can bring about truth, can beauty make lies seem appealing? The answer is yes. This is another reason why people don't like the arts. Satan in the garden, when he was speaking about the fruit from the tree, he didn't try to express ugliness, he tried to express beauty. And it actually says that Eve was allured by the vision of the fruit. It says that she saw that it was good. Satan in the book of Ezekiel is depicted as an artist. It says he has timbrels and pipes. He's a musician. The idea is that I can use beauty to actually warp truth. Now, we all know this to be true because we are in the modern consumeristic age. How often do companies use beauty in order to sell you something that's actually bad, right? I think about, I can't remember her name, but she was like kind of the it girl when I was a kid, and I'm much older than most of you, so you won't even know what I'm talking about anyway. But they paid her a lot of money. Carl's Jr. paid her a lot of money to eat a big old $6 burger on the hood of a car in a bikini. And everyone watching her like, this is so stupid. This girl has never even seen a burger before this commercial shoot. There's no way she eats these things on a regular basis. First of all. Secondly, that burger tastes like crap, and everybody knows that as well. But it worked, right? People bought the burger. And even though intellectually you can know that's stupid, there's something in your heart that's captivated by its beauty. You're allured by it, and that attraction moves you to buy, to consume. So that happens all the time to us. Companies use beauty to promote something that's actually ugly. This is why art is so dangerous. Because it communicates directly to the soul, it communicates experience directly from one human being to another, I can actually manipulate experiences, and I can share with you a lie. And you're not going to have the defense of your rationality to push it out. It will seep into your soul. A lie you can be talked out of a lie fairly easily. But if your soul recognizes something as beautiful, that's very hard to move you out, no matter how much rationality you have. How many of you guys have been in a bad relationship that you know for a fact is bad, and you just can't get out of it? No matter how many people, hopefully not the current one you're in, but the people in your life are saying, why are you with this person? They're awful, they're terrible, they mistreat you. And you're like, yeah, I know. And then you text them at midnight and you're like, why did I do that? It's because there's something in your soul that finds that person attractive. And you're pulled, you're called by that beauty. And your mind is no match for your soul. If your soul recognizes something as beauty, no amount of logic will talk you out of it. This is why we get ingrained in bad habits too. We find it pleasurable. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. You wouldn't eat the 5th donut if it didn't taste good, right? The reason why you keep going back is because it is good. So how do you fight that, by the way? Again, this is a bit of an aside as well, but I get really upset about this because I'm a biblical counselor, so this is what I do with the majority of my time. And I really get tired of pastors who think that moralizing lessons are sufficient to change the human heart. Well, I told them it was wrong. I don't understand why they're not stopping. If knowing something was wrong was sufficient to stop you, we would all be perfect. We all know it's wrong. That's why it's so bad. But it still pulls us. So what is the solution, by the way, to that? Because real quick, before we move on. Proverbs 27, verse 7 says this. It says, to the empty soul, every bitter thing seems sweet. But to the satisfied soul, you will loathe even the honeycomb. What's he saying? When you're hungry, you're more susceptible to garbage. That's why if you're, driving home and it's midnight and you just got off of a shift and you're going by McDonald's and you know it's crap, but it's open and it's convenient, you're going to go in because you're hungry. But if you had a really good, healthy meal and you're full and you drive by McDonald's, you're probably not going to stop in unless you have an eating disorder. You're probably going to drive right past because you recognize it. You recognize, I don't need it, that's bad. What the proverb is saying is if you consistently go back to something that is ugly and you know it's ugly, it's because you're not being captivated by something better. You're not seeing the genuine beauty that can call you out of that behavior. It is the better, greater love of God that helps you see the distorted, polluted, grotesque, hatred and mistreatment and manipulation of this world. And once you have it, you are satisfied. And when you're satisfied, you can resist the calls to lesser beauty. That's how it works. But anyway, let's wrap this up a little bit. Where does it come from outside the world? You remember I said that beauty is in the eye of the beholder? Most Christians just accepted that because we didn't like the arts anyway. So we're like, yeah, arts are stupid. So yeah, it's just totally whatever you think. Nobody believes that. Nobody actually believes that when they listen to the Wiggles, it is as good as Mozart. Nobody actually believes. There's a difference between taste and beauty. I'll get into that in a second. Nobody actually believes that the acting of Arnold Schwarzenegger is better than Leonardo DiCaprio. Nobody actually believes that. You can look in the mirror all you want and refer that platitude over and over again. You don't buy it. You don't believe it. There is a such thing as objective beauty. There is a such thing as things that are better than others. And if you have an idea of better, you have an idea of the best. So what's taste, by the way, to answer your question? Have you ever heard someone say, you have bad taste? What do they mean? They mean that the things you like suck. They mean that you have conditioned yourself to appreciate things that are not actually beautiful. And by the way, every child has bad taste. Every child has bad taste. My daughter would way rather listen to a terrible song sung by Lamb Chops than by an actual good song. And the reason why is because her attention span is so small and her capacity to appreciate things is so tiny that she couldn't appreciate something that's good. She doesn't have the capacity to do it yet. And so if I try to put something good in front of her, she's not going to be able to see it. A lot of us are still infants in our taste. We never really grew out of it. One of my friends he's a filmmaker, he said, it was at the time, it was Vines. How many of you guys remember Vines? It's kind of the precursor to TikToks. He said Vines are the death of art. And what he meant is that in order for art to actually be real, it has to be able to captivate your attention for longer than 10 seconds. Okay? And if your attention span is so small that you can be satisfied by a 10-second video, there's something wrong with you. You need to expand your horizons a little bit and maybe increase your taste. This is the person who actually says, I prefer McDonald's to a T-bone steak. You might, but your taste is bad, right? So when we say taste, that's what we mean, that there's a preference, but there's still an objective beauty behind it. There's also something called guilty pleasures. I have a bad case of guilty pleasures for action movies. I know they're bad. You don't have to talk me out of it. You know, when I'm watching John Wick 4, like, this is kind of a bad movie. I know, but I love it. You know, like it's awesome though, right? I know it's bad though. I know the acting is terrible. I know the plot doesn't make any sense. I know it's monotonous, but I just love it. I'll sit through 6 hours of Keanu Reeves killing people, you know, and it's amazing, right? But that's just again, it's a guilty pleasure. I know it's bad. We all have guilty pleasures in our life, by the way. We have things that we know are bad, but we do them anyway. But even when you use the phrase guilty pleasure, you're recognizing something. I like this, but I shouldn't. You're recognizing that your preference doesn't align with reality. That's why you use that phrase. If you believe, as we've been talking about tonight, about God, you can't believe in subjective beauty because all beauty has to have something that it correlates to. If there is no God, then you're right, we are gods. And we do create beauty from nothing. But if we're created in God's image and the creation itself exists as a reflection of his glory, then there is objective beauty, and you can hit the mark or you can miss the mark when you create art. You can make something good or you can make something bad. And just because you like it doesn't make it good. Right? Just because you prefer something doesn't actually make it good. So when the culture says that art is subjective, then the question becomes, well, then what's the purpose? Why make it? If I were to ask an artist who believes in objective beauty, why are you making this? They would say, because I want to make something beautiful. If you don't believe in objective beauty, though, then why are you making the art? And the answer is very simple, to spread a message. That's it, spread a message. That's why Hollywood has been in the decline recently, because people are making movies to spread messages. This is also why Christian movies are terrible, for the most part, as a general rule. It's because they're there to spread a message. They're not there to be beautiful. They're there to spread a message. So if we want to, again, experience these things correctly, you have to actually condition yourself to see what the messages are so that you can appreciate without being pulled along. You could see the beauty for what it is, and you could differentiate. So let me use an extreme example, and then I'll wrap up. An extreme example would be something like pornography, right? A lot of people view pornography. Many, many people go back to it, even though, again, we know it's bad. But what about it is bad? And this is what screws up a lot of people, by the way. When we say pornography is bad, what do we mean? It's bad. Because all of it can't be bad, right? There's something in it that you are finding beautiful. That's why you keep clicking. That's why you keep going back. What in it is beautiful? You could say, well, the actors and actresses are usually good looking. The act of sex in and of itself is beautiful. Love is beautiful. Goodness is beautiful. Pleasure is beautiful. There are all these elements of beauty in it. So what's ugly about it? It's the lie that the beauty of sex can be reduced down to simple bodily pleasure, devoid of any type of emotional connection or meaning. That's what's ugly about it. What makes sex worth having is the fact that you have united yourself emotionally and spiritually to someone first, and then you act out that with your body. That's the point. Pornography teaches an example or a vision of the world in which it is there for its own sake. Why do you engage in it? Because it's pleasurable, and it doesn't go any deeper than that. But if you don't understand that, and you say, well, pornography is bad, what you might start believing is that the elements that make up pornography start to become bad to you. This is why a lot of Christians have had an anti-sex bend to them, because they start adding up the elements that make up pornography and they discount all of them. So we need to be very careful when we're evaluating these things, because like I said, art is beautiful, art is amazing, but it's very powerful. And anything that has that much power to move people so incredibly must be treated with caution. But what do we usually do with the arts? Again, we just plop kids in front of the TV. We don't instruct them on how to actually appreciate and move in the arts. We just allow the arts to entertain them. And the arts are not simply there for entertainment. The arts inspire you. And they're inspiring you to do something and to experience things. And if you don't understand what those are, like I said, you're being led in a blindness.